Across the Arab world, we're now joined by John Graham. He's a former US diplomat at the American Embassy in Libya. Thanks so much for joining us here on RT. Now, you got to experience the rise of Qaddafi firsthand when you were based in Libya. So what do you think's going to happen to him now?
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here with you. And my experience in Libya is many years ago. I was there the night of the revolution. I was a young diplomat based in the embassy in Tripoli, but I was also the liaison officer to a huge, sprawling NATO base just outside of Tripoli. And so I was there when Qaddafi took power. Many of the people on his side were young Air Force officers whom I knew. So when he took power, he was a complete unknown. I mean, nobody knew who he was, not the CIA, not the KGB, not the Egyptian intelligence. Nobody knew. He was born in a tent in the desert. He came out of nowhere. So, of course, my country was, it was desperate to find out who he was because we were beginning to pump oil out of the country. And also this huge NATO base was on top of his real estate now. So who was he? I say this is a bit of background, but I'm sure your viewers will understand why I'm smiling a bit, because the one thing that my country cared about in those days, which was at the middle of the Cold War, was Qaddafi a Soviet dupe? In other words, was he in the employ of the Soviet Union, which would be very, very bad for us? So they sent me out there to find out who he was, and I found out very quickly that he hated the Soviets as much as he hated the Americans. What he was an Islamist zealot, a fundamentalist, and in those days that was considered good news. But anyway, that was my job, and I was given 1 week to do so. I came up with a page, and the key thing perhaps for today's events is that it was clear that Qaddafi was strong-willed. He was charismatic. He was very mercurial, very changeable. And he had a deep, deep sense of injustice on the things that he didn't like. For example, when American warplanes bombed Tripoli, killed his daughter, 2 years later in 1988, Qaddafi was behind the blowing up of Pan Am 103, the American airliner over Scotland. And he did that in vengeance for his daughter's death. So this is who the man was then, and I think it's who the man is now. OK,
well, now we know who he is. Does it surprise you the way he's behaving now in comparison to the way we've seen other leaders in similar positions behaving with their people? We're seeing him using great violent force against his own people. What do you make of his behaviour now?
I think it is different, and it's of great concern to your country as well as mine. He came to power in 1969 as a 27-year-old who saw himself as the savior of his country. And in many ways he was. He was a very good thing in those days. But he continues to see himself as the savior of the country, and now that he's 68, 69 years old, he sees himself as the father of his country, a father figure, and now his disrespectful children, if you will, that is to say the people of Libya, are disrespecting him, they're disobeying him, and he's furious with them. And he's lashing out, and that's what we're seeing.
But the thing is, what happens... OK, we're seeing that now, but what happens if he does go? You as a diplomat and your experience of what you've seen in these countries, the West really does fear that maybe radical Islamic fundamentalists could come to power in place of the likes of Qaddafi, Mubarak and other leaders. So what do you make of that fear? Is that justified, do you think? And does that justify Western interference in what's happening there at the moment in the Middle East?
I think it's country by country. I'm pretty convinced now that the revolt, the revolution in Egypt, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood is only a minor part of it, and even then, the Muslim Brotherhood is a long ways away from being what it was 30 years ago as a strong fundamentalist Islamist force. So I think in Egypt, perhaps we're okay. Tunisia, perhaps okay. Libya, I don't know. The fact of the matter, what's important to know in Libya is not whether or not the Islamists will be in control. It's like what would oppose them. Now, in Egypt, there's a very strong army, which is turned out to be a very stable force. You've seen the revolutionaries congratulating army officers in Tahrir Square, for example. So the army is a strong force. There's also a strong middle class, a pretty strong civil society, a lot of educated people. So there's some stability in the country. Libya, not like that. Qaddafi has made sure that there's no other power source. The army is not powerful. The army is not a force for stability. There's a very small middle class, very fewer educated people than in Egypt. So we're looking at a prospect of utter chaos in Libya that we weren't in Tunisia and in Egypt, and that's a very fearful thing. If it continues to get worse and worse, and a civil war erupts, and not just a few thousand, but tens of thousands of people are killed, then we're looking at the complete disintegration of the country.
Can I quickly ask you, we haven't got a lot of time, but I want to ask you, you were a diplomat, you were a part of a government that was actually supporting leaders like Qaddafi, Mubarak over many, many years. Do you feel a sense of regret, even a sense of hypocrisy, the fact that you were part of Western governments supporting these regional leaders who have now turned against their own people, and you're now calling for peace? I mean, people might say you were part of a hypocritic regime yourself.
Well, yes, you could say that. I'm not going tit for tat, but of course we could say that about the Soviet Union and the good old days of the Cold War as well. Yes, it's true. And you look at the way President Obama hesitated when the events in Tahrir Square began to erupt. He hesitated because Mubarak was, quote, on our side. He was an important friend in trying to gain peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Obama didn't know what would happen. No one seemed to know what would happen those first few days, so he hesitated. If I was in his shoes, I would be hard-pressed not to hesitate a bit, too. But the overall question you raise is an extremely good one. America has often sided with dictators and autocrats because, well, in the days of the Cold War, we did it because we wanted their vote in the United Nations against the Soviet Union, and of course, your country did exactly the same thing. So we did it to gain allies in the Cold War. Now we do it to gain help in fighting terrorism, to stabilize oil sources, those sorts of things, and that's. Whether I feel whether it's hypocritical, yes, it's hypocritical. But I'm also a realist. I wish it were a better world.
So what should U.S. foreign policy be now? What should Western European policy be now towards the Middle East, North Africa, these areas which are now suffering from turmoil? Leave them alone or interfere? But that it has been suggested if interference does happen, that could actually add fuel to the fire. What do you make of that? The next step.
I think there's a third path. I don't think we want to interfere. That will certainly backfire. Several of the quotes from people in Egypt you read before I came on demonstrate that. They don't want anyone telling them what to do, and that's perfectly fine. Staying completely out of it is not a good thing either. I mean, look what happened, the criticism on Obama when he started to help tried to stay above the fight the first few days. No, I think what Western nations can do is simply offer assistance. First of all, humanitarian assistance if that's needed, and in Libya it may very well be needed. And second of all, to see democracy not just as a good ideal, going back to our founding documents and the Declaration of Independence and all of that, but also for the first time to see the assistance of people to be Democrats as a good strategic choice. That is to say, we will be better off, the United States. The Western nations will be better off in the long term if people are not subjected to autocratic rule, if they have a voice.
Okay.
Because autocratic rule automatically means instability, and that helps nobody.
John Graham, very, very interesting to talk to you today here on RT. We appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us. Former U.S. diplomat to Libya, John Graham, joining us live from the U.S.